Starting with the scene Rocky Mountains _ 03, we're going to now add materials to this terrain and take a look at graphs and custom outputs and being able to use external dependencies and basically pass information from one graph or one function into another function. In this case, we're going to be taking information from the altitude from the terrain and passing it through to the material to control the distribution. So we're going to open up the terrain editor, and what we need to do is create some custom outputs. And the easiest way to do this is just to right click, add output, and select custom dependency. Now what we can do is connect this to anything, any other node output within the function, and send that information to basically any other function or graph within the scene, with the exception that you can only pass information into a material. Material information cannot be sent out, so custom dependencies do not work to extract information from materials. So we are going to select starting with the terrain fractal and choose the rough area output. The rough area output is available in the variable roughness fractal. If we go ahead and add just a simple fractal into here, it also has a second output in that roughness, but it really only works with variable roughness fractals or some of the compatible individual noises. One of the noises that does work within a simple fractal is the Perlin noise, terrain Perlin noise. And you'll find a few here or there that work a little bit better, but for the most part, there are just a few major ones that use that roughness best. If we want to get a preview, we can take the connection to the offset and connect it to the rough areas in order to see kind of what's going to be output. Keeping in mind too, it is also going to take into account the information controlling the gain from the eroded Rocky Mountains, which is one reason why I really like controlling the gain of the terrain fractal with other fractals, because then we can use that rough area output and have all the rest of that information pass through and all the distortions added. Now what we can do is change the reference feature size within the terrain fractal. The second output becomes active once something is connected to it. And you can change the scale. You'll have to use pretty small numbers for the most part. So that way we can change the size. You could also just set that back down to 0 and just pass all the information out, which is what I think I'm going to do. And now we're going to go ahead and take that link and take a look at the rough area output for the eroded Rocky Mountains. So we can see that. We could adjust the feature size, either really large features or very small elements. Go ahead and disconnect that, go back to the altitude, and reconnect it to the eroded Rockies. And then we could also output the distance to ridge. And it does look like, for the most part, the rough area output contains almost the same information. It's just kind of clipped. So just passing out the information from one should be enough. So we'll go back and reconnect that to the offset. I'm just going to copy and paste the custom dependency, disconnect it from the fractal, the terrain fractal, and connect it to the rough areas of the eroded Rocky Mountain. So I'm just going to add a left and right bracket for the title of the custom dependency, and just write terrain, and then we'll write Rocky for the other custom output. I like to add the two brackets ahead of time because it makes the custom output stand out from any other outputs that are available, and it makes it a little bit easier to kind of sort through things quickly. I want to note that in previous versions of Vue, you could use the rough areas to control terrain functions. However, as of version 9 or so, definitely with version 10, it creates unpredictable terrains, and information is not generated correctly, and you have just large blocks of the terrain raising up higher and lower, and the evaluation of it is just incorrect. So for now, use those second outputs and the rough area outputs for materials only. And it has to do with the reason why it's all kind of messed up now is because in version 9, the terrain editor was kind of optimized a bit to cut out the Z information that was being passed through. Just how there's two different outputs for the Rocky Mountains. There's just the regular altitude, which is that 2D slice where the Z origin just doesn't change, and that was shown in just the previous lesson. So that's kind of what's happened to everything, except with the Rocky Mountain, it happens during the vector input. And with other ones, you can still change the Z information, but once being passed out of the fractal itself or out of the terrain altitude, that rest of that information is actually cut from it. So 3D information is not passed out of a terrain either, so the altitude would look a little different if I was to send it to a material. And if we get a chance, I can show you a couple examples of that. I'm going to go ahead and show you how we can connect the materials to these outputs. So we're going to go ahead up to the Aspect tab with the Procedural terrain selected, and we're going to load a material. And I'm going to go ahead and load in from the materials that come with Vue. And we'll go to Landscapes, and we'll start with the grass variations. Go ahead and we can right-click, edit the material. You can also control-click to open it up right away. And double-clicking will also open it up. Sometimes when you click on a preview and you double-click, it will open up the browser to load in functions and materials and whatnot. Like in this case for the color production, if I double-click, it's going to open up the browser to load in a fractal or a function. Okay, so now what we're going to do is select to add a new layer. And I do want to note that what Vue remembers for the previous material selected, because it does typically remember, it's going to have two different choices for loading materials and then a separate choice for adding a material layer. So if you notice that you're just in another collection browsing different materials and then you notice it's different, well, it's because adding a material layer and changing a material do have separate storage information. Okay, so we're going to go back to the material layers collection, and let's select, we'll take a look at the fast rock orange and see how that looks over this. Now sometimes when you load in material layers and different materials, it will change the alpha boost setting. Right now at -50, we basically only have it acts as sort of an opacity layer, so it's becoming somewhat transparent and just overlaying on top of the material underneath it. That could be good for blending, but in this case I do want it to stand out a bit more. So what we can do is set the alpha boost to 0 in order to fully cover up the material underneath it. We can then use the Environment tab to adjust where the material is going to show. We can adjust the slope range, which is going to go from 0 to 180. So looking at a sphere, it'd be from going from the top all the way down the sides to 90 around the center point, and then 180 going down to the bottom. Altitude range can be adjusted like that as well, and we can also select the range of the altitude, and that's typically tied into the clip. So if we go back into the terrain and adjust the clipping area, this will give more control to the by object range for the altitude. Because otherwise the range is going to be that full clipping area. So it does make it difficult to control if the terrain is hardly even in the area. And then the fuzziness options are kind of a fall off for those. What we want to do right now is adjust the alpha production. So I'm going to control click on the alpha production, which doesn't look like it's opening the editor. Sometimes you can control click to open things up and edit them, and in other cases it just doesn't work. So we can right click and edit the function if it fails. The layer painting node that is connected to this alpha is part of the painted layer within the terrain editor, and it does allow you to mix fractals with any painted layers. Because we added this material outside the terrain editor, it is going to default to a full cover, which is black. It is a little confusing in Vue because typically alphas, white is the area you see, so it takes a little getting used to if you're working with other applications and the way they use their alphas. Where normally black would be not showing at all and zero opacity. So what we're going to do is right click and add input node external dependency. With this we can choose from the objects in the scene, and the procedural terrain 2 is the object we created with our function, and then we can see those two custom outputs, and you can see how the brackets really make those ones stand out too. So it doesn't really blend in with the rest, because otherwise there's no definable way other than the name to know what your custom outputs are. Typically you'll know anyway, but it just makes it a little easier to work with it faster. So let's take a look first at the rocky output, and we can just go ahead and connect that to the layer painting. If you want to subtract the other way around, what you can do is select the link between the layer painting and the external dependency, add a filter, and we can change it to the opposite filter, which is going to flip it around. May need to clip it a little bit, depending. But this one I'm going to stick with it the way it is for now and just remove the opposite. Because the colors of these two materials are pretty similar, you might need to use the marker or the highlighter in order to see it better. So just for now, I'm going to have that highlighter red on it. And then I'm going to go ahead and just save my camera. And we'll just move it up a little higher so that we can view it from above. I'm also going to take the ground and just move it down a little bit, because we do have some areas that are going through. So we can see a lot of details showing up that are passing the material through, and then the larger peaks and mountains don't have the material at all on it. Now if you do want the distance to ridge, we can also use that output just to have it a quick way to move over. So we'll go back into the function, just copy the rocky one, paste it, call it distance, and then connect that to the distance to ridge. And that just so we don't have to filter it out the other one. Now the distance to ridge is going to be more of the fine details and not such a high contrast. And if we just go back and take a look, here's the rough areas, and then this is what it looks like, the distance to ridge. I had one small change in the height, but I did go and change that back. Now these big holes that are showing up in the large features, that's actually caused by the rocks. So anywhere there's rocks at a certain iteration level, it will separate those rocks, and those rocks are part of the 2D output. Also the 3D output, but they basically cause it to cut out those features. So if you want to remove the rocks or move them to a different iteration level, if you want to have more coverage, you can do that, because now we have a lot more detail created from the terrain fractal method. We could also turn off the rocks. Let's go ahead and put them in at 3. Actually, we'll go ahead and just turn them off for now. So without the rocks, we no longer have those giant holes showing up, and we can grab the finer details. So this way you can use this roughness to control a pretty cool material layer. Just want to go ahead and switch that over to the distance output, and then we can see the additional output and what that looks like. So now if we go over here to the left, the render output, and select compare, we can take a look at the difference between the renders. We could also turn on the difference automatically. Now there's a large variation in the brightness and the overall intensity, so that does show up maybe a little too intensely. Distance to ridge usually works, or it looks better with the separate mountains turned off. So the rough area output is probably going to be the better one for this, although we could kind of cut out the bottom portion just by adjusting the altitude range for this one. Let's just go ahead and switch this over to the rough areas for the terrain fractal and see how that one turned out. So a pretty nice overlay, nice little alpha showing up there. And I'm going to go ahead really quick and just invert that so we can see it in sort of a different gamma. Select filter, set its opposite. And actually, because the output is really only 0 to 1, we do need to increase that. So first I'm just going to multiply it by 2. And actually, instead of putting in a multiply, because we could multiply it and then offset it, but then we'd also have to apply an opposite filter. And right now we're going beyond the range. So it's really just easier just to set up a map filter, because we can do all of that in one. So our range is 0 to 1, and then we can define the output. So if we want to do opposite, we just swap the output range lower and upper values. So this is the inverse version, and then with a higher contrast, because we modified the output range. So we'll be able to use these different alphas to really control the materials based on the features and not just slope. and altitude.